We will begin this afternoon with a panel consisting of Taku Lee, a political scientist from the University of California at Berkeley, Michael Jones Correa from Cornell University, Dana Chisnell, a consultant with Usability Works, and Whitney Quisenberry, a principal consultant at WQ. Welcome. Professor Lee, would you care to begin?
Sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank Chair Bauer and Ginsburg and thank the other commissioners for inviting my testimony here today. My name is Taku Lee, and I'm a professor of political science and law at the University of California at Berkeley. In thinking about the importance of a fair and just system of election administration, I took as a guiding precept the words of former Chief Justice Earl Warren, who, in crafting the court's opinion in Reynolds v. Sims, asserted that the right to exercise the franchise in a free and unimpaired manner is preservative of all other basic civil and political rights. And so the specific barrier to that free and unimpaired exercise of the franchise that I've been asked to say a few things about is the barrier of language, and my focus will be specifically as that barrier affects Americans of Asian origin. The handout is lengthy, so just to organize my time, I thought I would just start with my 5 main points, which are that Asian Americans as a group are rapidly growing as a segment of the U.S. population. As a population, they are heavily foreign-born and tremendously ethnically and linguistically diverse. It's also a characteristic of Asian Americans that they under-participate relative to their number in the elections process. And fourth, language is an important factor in this under-participation. And fifth, as defined by current law, there are significant gaps in compliance in Section 203 covered jurisdictions, further adding to the need for some work in this area. So now to flesh in detail some of these 5 main points. First, on the population itself in numbers. In absolute size, Asian Americans have grown from less than 1 million Americans in 1960 to roughly more than 18 million today, and it's a population that's still growing. In proportions, it's roughly about 6% of the total U.S. population. To give a better sense of the decade growth, the next slide just shows in the last decade that no other group, at least as we as a country classify people by race and ethnic origin, has grown as rapidly as have Asian Americans. And this figures for the census category of Asian alone. If you take the more capacious category of Asians alone and in combination, the rate of growth is even more dramatic. And then in terms of its relationship to migration, in the last 5 years, there's been no other region of the world that has been sending newcomers to the United States at a higher rate than has Asia. So specifically, Asia has displaced Mexico and Central America as the largest regional contributor to legal migration to the United States. Relevant to the charge of this commission, there are just 2 additional demographic characteristics to point out. One is that as a group, Asian Americans are heavily foreign-born. So 2 out of every 3 Asians in the United States were born outside of the United States. And if you just focus in on adults, that figure rises to 80%. And so this is a population that's disproportionately comprised of political, greenhorns and tenderfoots. In terms of the legal foundations of language accommodation, that means that a disproportionate number of Asian Americans in terms of educational opportunities have received their education and their language outside of the United States. They come from a dizzying array of different national origins, and each of these national origins with at least one, if not more than one, different non-English mother tongues. In terms of language itself, more than 3 out of every 4 Asians in the United States report speaking a language other than English at home, and this is a figure that has been growing pretty steadily over time, and it's much higher than the 21% figure for the country as a whole. Then in terms of the Census Bureau's definition of what counts as limited English proficiency, nearly half, 47% of those Asians who report speaking a language other than English at home report that their facility with English is less than very well. So when you combine those two things together, speaking a language other than English at home together with not speaking English very well, that's roughly 1 out of every 3 Asian Americans who are limited English proficient. The exact figure is about 36%. And you'll notice on this slide also that there's significant variance across groups. That's the demographic baseline. Where do elections come in? As I said, one of the starting observations about Asian Americans is their underparticipation. So earlier I mentioned that Asians in the United States are 6% of the total U.S. population. They are just under 4% of the citizen population in the United States, and when you look at who votes, they are less than 3% of the voting population in the United States. And that has been a pretty steady gap over time. There's no evidence that this gap is closing. You can also see this underparticipation relative to other groups. So this is the percentage of citizens who turn out to vote, and as you can see, the rates of voting for whites and African Americans in this country is discernibly higher than it is for Asian Americans and Latinos. For Asian Americans, one of the key gaps is between being a citizen, whether by birthright or naturalization, and registering to vote. So only 55% of Asians who are citizens in the U.S. Have registered to vote, and then once they've registered to vote, their rates of voting are comparable. They're somewhat lower, but they're comparable to that of other groups. So the current population survey asks its respondents who have not registered to vote for the reasons why they have not registered to vote. And what this slide shows is that Asian Americans, more than any other group, are likely to mention that difficulty with English is a real reason for their not having registered to vote. So the total averages over the last 3 presidential year CPS surveys have been in the order of 1 to 1.5%. In the 2012 CPS, almost 10% of Asian Americans reported language issues as being a reason for why they did not register to vote. This next slide is just to reinforce the important point that language is just one among many factors, both for Asians and non-Asians, as to why people don't register to vote. So I don't want to overblow the claims of language here, but in terms of groups that have mentioned language as being a significant barrier to vote registration, Asian Americans stand out as a group who do mention language issues as being important. Okay. I'll quickly go through some evidence from 2 additional surveys. Asian Americans are a group for which it's very hard to get good data, including in sources like the CPS. So I would just note that these 2, as I see them, are the 2 most exhaustive data sources on what's happening politically with Asians in the United States today. And just observe that to properly survey this community, you need to interview in at least 9 Asian languages, and roughly half of your respondents will choose a non-English language of interview simply to be able to talk about politics with somebody on the telephone. This slide just reinforces the gap that you see in participation by disaggregating Asians into those who speak English very well and those who are limited English proficient. Voter registration rates, that's about a 20% gap between those 2 groups. And then in terms of voter turnout, there's a 10% gap between those 2 groups. Then this slide reinforces the demand among Asian Americans to have some in-language election material support. So of those limited English proficient respondents, they were asked, would you make use of in-language election materials if they were available? And about 80% say yes. And then a final cut from these data is to take those respondents who are currently in covered jurisdictions and to ask them if in their experience whether they have voted in person or whether they have voted by mail, whether they received some form of language assistance. And you will see that the rates are pretty high in terms of Asian Americans, even those who live in covered jurisdictions, who have not received language support. The rates are lower for those who vote by mail than they are for those who vote in person, but these are pretty high rates in covered jurisdictions of not receiving language support. Finally, I'll just show a few slides from what I see as being the most exhaustive effort by 4 advocacy organizations to study how well compliance is going on in currently covered jurisdictions, jurisdictions covered for different Asian languages. I'll go through these slides just very quickly. So among the things that you would want to look for are, are translations there, and are they good translations? So in the precincts that were studied, in 45% of the cases, this report finds that translations are either missing or they're incomplete or otherwise displaced. Another thing you might look for is whether there are bilingual workers there, poll workers there to be able to assist. In 43% of the cases, there were poll workers, but they were missing their badges. In 23% of the cases, they were simply missing any poll workers who could afford bilingual assistance. A third thing you might want to look for is whether or not the poll workers who are there to offer language assistance are proactive about offering that assistance, or simply wait for somebody to come up and seek their help. And then what this study finds is that in more than 1 in 3 cases, they were not proactive. And then finally, for voters who come and whose names are missing from the registry rolls, you might want to see if language is an issue, whether they're actually offered a provisional ballot. And what this study finds is that in 1 out of 7 cases, that did not happen, that they were offered a provisional ballot. So those are the main things that I wanted to share with the Commission. And so then in summary, this is a rapidly growing segment of the U.S. population and the electorate. Linguistic diversity is a characteristic, and partly as a result of their being very heavily foreign-born, language remains a barrier to their full participation in elections. And there are studies that show that there is a demand for in-language election material support among Asian Americans, and that there are persistent gaps in compliance in existing covered jurisdictions. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Professor Correa.
Thank you to the Commission again for inviting us here to present our work, and I hope this is helpful to the Commission as it carries on. So, I am speaking today on something which is not appearing on the screen, on language provisions under the Voting Rights Act. There we go, thanks. And its effectiveness and implementation. So I teach political science at Cornell. The work that I do is on immigrant political incorporation. And this is part of a series of papers that I've written with co-authors on Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act. Section 203 was introduced in 1975 when Congress extended the Voting Rights Act to protect linguistic minority groups. And it protected it under 2 sections, Section 4F and Sections 203, and required that materials be available in localities where there were linguistic minorities, originally over 5% of the total, and then now 10,000 individuals, or 5% of the total of voting-age citizens in any political subdivision. So when the Supreme Court struck down Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act and Shelby v. Holder, it didn't actually affect Section 4F or Section 203, so this coverage is still in place. So this particular study looks at coverage under Section 203, and the design of the study is hinged on sending Cornell undergraduates to verify materials and personnel available at registrars and DMVs in covered counties. So we sent undergraduates to 94 counties, and they would appear at the registrar's office and ask if there was someone who could speak the covered language and if they were available, and then also asked if there were materials available in the covered languages. And so this first map is all the counties covered under Section 203. These are the counties covered under Section 203 for Spanish language minorities, which is the focus of this particular project. And these are the counties that were covered in the study. Oops, I realize I'm clicking the wrong thing. There we go. Counties covered in the study. So these are the 94 counties that cover 15 states. 28 of those counties, I should just note, are counties that were covered under state provisions, not under the federal provisions of the Voting Rights Act, and the paper discusses those separately. So, we wanted to look at variation in implementation of the Voting Rights Act. So there's a good deal of work looking at the effectiveness of the Voting Rights Act, Section 203, finding that covered counties, in fact, do have higher voter registration and turnout rates for covered minorities. And some of that work I've written myself along with others. So there's actually quite there's a gap in the kind of work looking at implementation rather than effectiveness. And so this study in particular was interested in implementation and then the outcomes of this variation in implementation. So of the counties that we visited, 1 in 7 could not offer registration materials in languages other than English. 1 in 4 indicated they did not have personnel present who could offer aid in languages indicated under the Voting Rights Act, and 1/3 of the individual covered jurisdictions in the study failed to provide either translated materials or assistance by bilingual personnel required by law. So, as Professor Lee mentioned in his presentation, there is a quite substantial gap in actual implementation of the law, even though the registrars were aware of the law. So, we then turned to looking at whether this actually mattered. And this slide is simply looking at, it's simply a bivariate plotting of registration and voting for covered and non-covered counties. So the covered counties are the ones we visited, and the non-covered counties are everything else in those 15 states. And just sort of eyeballing this, you can see that there's that coverage actually makes a quite substantial difference. So the paper then turns to multivariate regression analyses, which I'm sure you're happy I'm not presenting in a slide form. So these are just the kind of takeaway points. So all things equal, a county covered under Section 203 has a voter turnout rate that's 15% higher than non-covered counties. Counties that provide Spanish language staffing see Latino registration that's 6% higher than those without Spanish conversant staff. Counties providing Spanish language materials have Latino registration that's about 4% higher than in counties that do not provide those materials. And registration rates increase over time the longer a county is covered under Section 203. And there are similar kinds of results for voter turnout. So a county covered under Section 203 has Latino voter turnout that's 11% higher than non-covered counties. Availability of Spanish language staffing, so counties have 4% higher Latino turnout than non-covered counties, and a provision of Spanish language registration materials is associated with a 6% increase in Latino voter turnout. Lastly, this particular study looks at possible explanations for differences in implementation. So why do we see this variation? And we look at 4 different things: the cost of enforcement, host jurisdiction, political ideology, oversight by local actors, so whether or not there's a Latino elected official present, and ex post sanctions. Cost of enforcement by itself wouldn't explain a lot of the variation. We do include controls in the model for the size of the county, whether it's urban or rural, and these are not significant. And we don't, the paper does not go into great detail on ex post sanctions. There haven't been a lot of ex post sanctions in states that have been sued by the Department of Justice, like New Mexico. Don't see any diminishment in poor implementation. So the 2 that we focus on in the study are host jurisdictions, political ideology, and oversight by local actors. And what we find is that host counties, host county's ideology, political ideology, has the greatest effect. So states whose voters report the Republican Party in presidential elections more than one standard deviation from the mean are 19%.
I apologize. I just take it one step. If you
Yes.
slow down a little bit, this
Yeah.
is the first time we've ever told a witness to take a little more time. But
Yes.
I've had a little trouble following this piece, and I know it's important.
Yes. Okay, so these are multivariate regressions. We're trying to explain why we see this variation in turnout and registration. So we control for a number of factors. One of the factors we control for is whether there's a Republican governor, Republican state legislature, and voter turnout. So the difference between Republican and Democratic vote for the previous presidential election. So it turns out that states that have more Republican voters are 19 percentage points less likely to provide bilingual personnel. States with Republican governors are 27 points less likely to provide bilingual personnel. So the paper goes into some detail about why it is that local election officials might feel that they can shirk these federal responsibilities, and it's partly that they're, in a sense, serving two masters. So they're getting one set of signals from their local elected officials and from their local constituents, another set of signals from the DOJ, and they're choosing to listen to their local constituents and their local elected officials rather than the DOJ. So just to conclude, what this suggests is the need for better and more oversight of actual implementation. I think this question of implementation is one that has received relatively little attention. There's much more discussion of the letter of the law than the implementation of the law. And so we would be better served by paying more attention to this local shirking responsibilities, by better monitoring and oversight by the Department of Justice. Whoops, I realized I skipped a lot of slides. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Snell?
Thank you. Commissioners, thank you for this chance to talk with you today. To the election officials here and in the audience, thank you for doing amazing work. I know that for many local election officials, a good election is a done election. The research from my team and many people who've gone before us shows that good elections reflect clear processes, efficient, effective poll workers, and the importance of usability and accessibility across the voter experience. Good elections are clear. They have verifiable results, in which the margin of victory is larger than the number of residual votes. Clear, verifiable results come from carrying out the voter intent. As my team likes to say, cast as intended, counted as cast. I'm Dana Chisnell, and the talented team at the Center for Civic Design has put together a couple of studies to visualize the voter experience for you today. In our research in the fall of 2012, we asked, what questions do people have about the upcoming election? Our study had a small convenience sample of 41 participants who were geographically diverse. They used their own county's website to answer their questions. There are a lot of interesting findings about the usability of county election websites, as you might imagine, but what's relevant today are the questions that participants asked. The most asked question was, what's on the ballot? We've also spent more than 100 hours over the last 9 months studying how elections work on Election Day by being in polling places for elections large and small across the country. Now, let's follow a voter through the journey based on our data and observations. Across our journey map, at intervals, are questions voters asked. These represent activities, something a voter might do to get their questions answered. So let's see how well the websites did. The County election websites helped 60% of our participants who asked the question find out what was going to be on their ballot. 72% found information about voting absentee. 60% of the participants who asked whether they could vote early found their answers on county websites. County websites helped 65% find where their polling place was. However, only 35% of those who asked learned who their current representatives were from their county websites. 69% got an answer to whether they needed a voter ID, and we were delighted to see that 80% of participants who asked questions about registering to vote or about the registration status did find answers to the questions on their county's website. But in preparing to vote, one of the questions that came up for many of our participants was, how do I actually vote? They wanted to know what to expect at the polling place and what the voting system would actually be like. Tragically, this question went unanswered for all but about 13% of participants who wanted to find the answer to this question on their county website. If we look at the journey through answering these questions, it's easy to see that first, the best we got was an 80% success rate on one question. There are a couple of sizable dips too. Ideally, you'd want everyone to find their answers. And when we fill this space, we can see how far we have to go to improve the experience and at which points. This filled space actually is the window of opportunity. There is a lot of the franchise in that space. It's the room for improvement. So now let's look at the polling place and what goes on with voting there. Same basic format, but as we're basing this map on observational data, I'll show you a composite visualization that depicts one of the typical voter paths. The voter gets to the polling place. If they're driving, there's parking to find, which can be tough in some urban places. Signage probably helps them find their way to the right entrance, but unless there's a queue, finding the exact location of polling can be challenging. Arriving in the room where polling is happening, the voter has to figure out where to go first. If there are multiple precincts or election districts housed in the same polling place, they often don't know which is theirs. They go to the wrong one, and they get redirected. Eventually, they get checked in, get a ballot, and then head to the voting booth, where we encountered the death of 1,000 cuts that is the ballot. For many voters, this is the first time they see what's on their ballot. The voter has to figure out how to mark the ballot and choose which contests to vote in. There's pressure to complete the entire ballot, but some voters don't feel comfortable voting in contests where they just don't know who the candidates are and what the issues are. They wonder if their votes will count if they don't vote the entire ballot, and having many different kinds of contests on the ballot can also slow voters down. If there are contests on the second side of a printed ballot, voters often forget, or they don't even realize that they need to vote on those two. Finally, they finish marking the ballot. The voter casts the ballot. If there's a tabulator, they may get a message from it if they've overvoted or undervoted, and they'll have some decisions to make about what to do. In some cases, they may get the ballot back to spoil, replace, and vote again. When completely done casting, the voter gets a sticker and leaves. So that's the big picture of what a voter goes through. The specific steps may be slightly different or in a different order, but elections are nothing if not ritualistic, and this map doesn't account for a voter showing up at the wrong polling place, or having to vote on a provisional ballot, or voting on an accessible voting system. This is what you might call the happy path, the optimal steps for a voter to follow, and yet we can see that our observations suggest that it's not perfect. It's pretty good, though, and some of the issues are easily correctable. For example, many jurisdictions have put a greeter at the main entrance to direct people to the correct precinct right away. Having a well-trained greeter or a team of greeters closes that gap, and then we're left with voters' direct interaction with the ballot. These kinds of maps are tools for benchmarking the experience voters are having now and measuring improvements over time. To close the gaps, there's some simple questions to ask. They might seem obvious, but when you specifically test for them and measure voter success, you can also take remedial action. For example, my team in developing the field guides to ensuring voter intent end each field guide with a checklist like this one. To close the gap, the field guides offer evidence-based prescriptive steps for improving design, usability, and accessibility that virtually any jurisdiction can implement within the constraints they face in election code, voting systems, and the resources that they have. Design, usability, and accessibility are vital across the voter experience. When a voter can prepare efficiently and vote effectively, election administration works well too. Conducting simple checks for usability and accessibility can be quick, inexpensive, and lead to continuing improvement, election to election. We urge the Commission to use a similar approach in its final report of best practice recommendations, and we encourage local jurisdictions to call on their communities to help them run these checks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Quisenberry.
Commissioners and chairs, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today. I'm Whitney Quisenberry, also from the Center for Civic Design. I have another role as the grants coordinator of the ITIF Accessible Voting Technology Initiative, which is funded by the AC. I mention this because I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the projects we're doing there. What I'd like to talk about today is to share some ideas about how accessibility can be a source for innovation in elections, not perhaps the most obvious tack to take on that. Here we are at a commission again. This is not the first time we've been around this block and tried to solve these problems, specifically how to ensure that everyone, including voters with disabilities, older adults, limited English proficiency, etc., can vote with the same independence and privacy as any other voter. Legislation from the ADA to HAVA to the Voting Rights Act have included requirements for accessible voting, but why then have we failed to actually be able to meet this goal? Yes, there's been progress. HAVA certainly has enabled us to have an accessible voting machine in every precinct. The question is, we may have something that is accessible, but is it usable and is it actually used? Despite bright spots that I think we hear about a lot on these panels, ultimately I think incremental change is not that satisfying, and I started thinking about what is it that we need to do to sort of break through this to try to get past that. One explanation is that the different pace of change with technology in our personal lives and in our public lives may be part of the problem. We can think about this with a visualization I borrowed from Stuart Brand. If we think about the different aspects of civic life as lanes on a circular track, and we can see how fast each lane has to move to maintain a consistent pace. In the very inner lane, we have laws and regulations, which usually have the slowest cadence of change. The next lane is voting systems, which I put in a rather inner lane because of the time it takes to develop a system, to certify it, to purchase it and deploy it, just takes time. The next lane has the election process, voter habits and cultures, which can change even between legislation or between voting systems. But in the outside lane, we can see modern technology practically racing along at internet speed. The pace at which new technologies have been adopted are particularly fast and seems to be accelerating these days, probably not a surprise to any of us here. It took 100 years to get from the introduction of the telephone to the internet, but since the 90s, we've seen one product after another, one system after another, change our lives, whether we're talking about Google or the JAWS screen reader, which was first released in 1989, all the way up to iPads in 2010. For elections, I think what this change of pace and technology change has brought is rising expectations about how available, how convenient, and how accessible information and interactions with government can and should be. So I suggest that what we need is new ways to think, not as isolated silos of work with security, design, accessibility, election process working in separate rooms, but with collaborative innovation and with everyone at the same table with the same goals. First, a universal voting system, one that everyone can use. a flexible system that allows for differences not only in voters, but election procedures and state laws, and robust, something that was able to keep up with the pace of change while supporting elections we can have confidence in. I have 3 suggestions for how we can do this that I'd like to talk about. The first is to adopt best practices from industry. It's no secret that elections are not the best funded department in the world, and that they work under a lot of constraints. Those aren't situations in which there's a lot of time, cycles, or resources to do experimentation. And experimentation is really the key. It means trying out new ideas, doing things like usability testing, doing the follow-up research and the feedback, iterating the design that is the key to successful innovation. Having the idea is the easy part, making it work is the hard part. But there are products and processes and best practices that we can borrow from industry, carefully selecting to those that add to our ability to make elections fully accessible. I'd like to talk about one small example from industry of something that didn't start out as accessible but became so, and that's the iPhone. When the iPhone was first introduced, it was described in the disability community as a slab of glass. There was a lot of dismay about how this was setting accessibility back because it had even fewer keys on it than a BlackBerry did. And the debate raised a lot of questions about whether accessibility and innovation are in conflict, which I think mirror some of the discussions we hear about whether security and accessibility are in conflict in elections. Fast forward to today, and the iPhone and the iPad are considered best in class for mobile device accessibility. Now, what changed in the meantime? Because that's really where the interesting lesson is. I think it was a mix of 3 things. First, Apple wanted to meet the legal mandate so they could sell the iPhone to government under either 508 or state laws. So there was a push. There was a commitment to finding a solution, and the solution they found was innovative. They didn't redesign the hardware, they redesigned the software, and in doing so, they embedded the screen reader and the other assistive technologies deep into the operating system. So it's not just the phone that becomes accessible, but every app on that platform becomes accessible with really no particular work by the developers. They have to not break it, but they don't have to create anything. And I think that's something we could learn from, which is thinking about where we bake accessibility in makes a difference to how successful it can be, especially as we've heard about all the challenges of implementing grand goals across a lot of levels. The next idea is to create better ways to collaborate. Obviously, we work with each other, but in 2012, AVTI ran 2 innovation projects. The first was a series of workshops held at Georgia Tech with election officials, voting system vendors, designers, and people with disabilities. For industry designers, this is a pretty common practice of running collaborative design studios, but it was new in this world. And afterwards, we got a lot of positive comments that the structured work sessions were for advocates a chance to get out of the echo chamber, and for election officials a chance to work together instead of in a confrontational way. The second project was even more experimental. It was Open IDEO, which is a project of one of the large industrial design companies, and it created an open challenge to designers around the world who had no experience with elections, weren't necessarily American, to think about how we could create accessible elections. As an example of how this worked, one of the ideas that this group of some 800 or so designers got entranced with was the idea of pop-up voting centers, mobile voting vans, and that was actually one of our winning concepts. They didn't know that at the same time in Iowa, election officials were actually creating pop-up polling sites. They have a process by which during early voting, a community can request a polling place for part of a day at their location. So what I think we saw was not brand new ideas, but ideas coming up from industry that might have some traction in elections. And our question then is how do we, if we could bring that level of enthusiasm and creativity and brain power to explore new ideas, how could we put those to use in elections? Finally, and perhaps most controversially, I want to suggest that we should design for the extremes. Conventional wisdom suggests that we design for the center of the curve, and then we sort of slowly expand outwards, expanding from usability to accessibility to the real extreme needs. But I think that if we actually start from the outside, we might find that it works better for everybody. One example in two projects we've funded, the first at MSU is looking at using a joystick for for manipulating a voting system. Joysticks turn out to work very well for people who have low dexterity but high force, and people who have minimal movement and need low force controls. But they're also very familiar to pretty much anyone who plays games and does a lot of other, drives a car, for example. So there's a place where we might look at something that sounds like an extreme for people with extreme needs, but might prove to be a common system. Another example is work on making a ballot enclosure that could take any tablet but wrap it in an accessible thing. We might think about meeting cognitive needs as another example. We know that election information can be baffling to many in our research, and we've certainly seen the need for plain language. But we can go further and think about how to make information work effectively for people with traumatic brain injury, with people with aphasia, and we might find that some of the things we learned there would make it easier for everyone to work and to learn and become more engaged even before Election Day. Finally, it's easy to see how the needs of overseas voters and flexibility could apply to many people. In one usability session, we met a woman who had advanced cancer. She said she'd like to vote in person, but she never knows from day to day whether it will be a good day for her or not. She actually it was from the election website thing. She reported going to her election website and learning about early voting there and discovering that she could go and vote, not just get a ballot by mail. So there's an example of someone who's not overseas, not military, doesn't meet the census definition of someone with a disability, but who's nonetheless helped by those features. So in closing, innovation does not have to be dramatically disruptive. I urge you, the Commission, to consider an approach that combines best practice recommendations with ways to create opportunities for collaborative input from all. We can take good ideas and turn them into great elections. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions from the commissioners? Professor Pursley.
This is for Whitney Quisenberry. Just a quick question based on your discussion of iPads. Is it your view that the off-the-shelf types of technology are, all other things being equal, sort of better for people with disabilities than the proprietary systems that are out there? Is that sort of, since you deal with a lot of different technologies?
I think one of the challenges is that when we say off-the-shelf technology, we rub up against the digital divide issue, right? VoiceOver is only as good as whether you know how to use it. So I think some of the projects that we've been looking at AVTI are how can we use off-the-shelf technology as an inexpensive platform for a ballot or a ballot marking system that is designed so that it can be used by anyone, even if they're not very familiar with all technologies. I think assuming that someone knows a particular kind of technology we're a big country, and we have a lot of voters, and we have to think about meeting all of their needs. So I wouldn't just say, let's give everybody an iPad, but I might say a commercial tablet could be an inexpensive platform.
Commissioner Patrick.
Thank you. This question is for our two professors. Very interesting information, and I'm wondering if in your studies, if there was any consideration given to jurisdictions or review given to jurisdictions that were recently covered under Section 203 in the last census determinations, and if so, if that had any impact versus a jurisdiction that's been covered for a long time and maybe either has established or should have established these procedures. And then the second question to that is, did you notice any sort of distinction between jurisdictions that were previously covered under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act or not?
So on the first part, the length of time covered under Section 203, there is some difference between counties that have, so the longer a county has been covered under Section 203, the more likely it is to see this both difference in implementation and difference in turnout and registration. But it's a relatively minor difference. So every 10 years a county is covered, we see a 2% increase in both registration and turnout versus just being covered at all leads to much greater increases in turnout and registration. So even if a county is very recently covered, you see these higher effects on turnout and registration. And whether it was covered under Section 5, I don't think we looked at that in this study. I did look at this in a previous paper, not looking at implementation, but simply looking at effects on turnout and registration, and the effects are similar for both Section 203 and Section 5.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that question. That's an excellent one to ask of the two communities that Professor Jones-Correa and I look at. The Advancing Justice report that I include in my presentation is designed to look explicitly at whether or not there's a difference in the compliance gap between the newly determined covered jurisdictions post-2011. I know that the report finds some significant difference in these new jurisdictions. I can't speak with specificity to what they actually were, so if you go back to some of the slides in the handouts, you'll notice that part of what I presented was counties that seem to do particularly well in terms of compliance with language accommodation, and counties that seem to do quite poorly. So if you are limited English proficient, you, all things equal, would want to be in Kings County, Washington, and you really wouldn't want to be, if you're Bengali, you really wouldn't want to be in Hamtramck, Michigan. I'm happy to include more detailed comparing the new determinations of coverage in the written paper that I submit to the Commission.
I think that it would be interesting to look at for those who are recently covered, whether or not it improves over time, and because we have some that have already been covered, whether or not there is any distinguishing factors there, because maybe we can identify some best practices in places like King County that do an excellent job of it, that can perhaps inform some of the other jurisdictions that are maybe getting this sort of coverage for the first time and are looking to receive some sort of instruction or assistance with that. So thank you.
Commissioner Mays?
This is for the professors. When you talk about voters that don't have English proficiency, do you know how much more difficult it is for jurisdictions to reach out to them using social media? Or are they totally ignored when they go into that vein?
That's also a great question. I actually don't know of a study that looks at that, although I would be surprised if there isn't one out there. What I do know from studies I am aware of Asian Americans is any kind of outreach in advance of elections seems to do more than doing nothing, whether it's direct contact between elected officials or election officials with different community organizations, or I would infer through technologically based outreach efforts like social media. I think things that you do in advance of elections, as I see it, seem to have an effect in terms of reducing that language barrier.
Well, and the one thing that I'm focusing on now is we had a panel dealing with disasters. So that is not as much advanced planning, it's more sometimes in the moment. And so I'm even more interested when there has been a hurricane or a power outage or whatever it is, whether those communities are being included in the social media outreach. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other things that I would think would be a positive recommendation in terms of language access would be using social media on Election Day as a way of crowdsourcing where are the flashpoints. So sometimes, as one of the other panelists said, a good election is a done election. And there's such a scramble to get to Election Day that precincts may not be aware of themselves of some of the problems that they see. And so if there's a way of crowdsourcing where are the real gaps in terms of, poll workers not wearing badges or things of that nature that have to do with language access, I think that would be another really good way of improving election administration.
And when they talk about Chinese, are we assuming it's Mandarin and not Cantonese?
Well, part of what you're identifying is some of the gaps even in the existing data collection. So I can't tell from certain data sources, whether those distinctions are made or not. Or even for that matter, in the current population survey, which is some of the best data we have about voter registration and voting, there, if you ask somebody from CPS, they will say that there is some Asian language support, but there's no way of knowing what that language support is of the people that are interviewed in the CPS. And one of the things that we know as academics is the language in which you interview somebody, especially when they are disproportionately foreign-born, makes a huge difference in terms of what kind of answers they will give you to the same set of questions.
And then I was just going to shift gears and I quit. So, Ms. Quisenberry, I have just an observation rather than a question. You mentioned borrowing industry practices, and you mentioned one in particular, which is the mobile van. Actually, two companies that I've worked for use mobile vans for their business. One is Colgate-Palmolive, because they took the dental clinics around the country, depending on where they were based. And the second one is Allstate, because when there were disasters, depending on how bad the disaster is, you take the van to where the customers are. So.
And New Jersey actually did a sort of variation on that, because I know some of our polling places were actually mobile command center vans set up in front of the building that still didn't have power. So.
Commissioner McGann?
This is a question that I think goes across both subjects, language accessibility and design and accessibility. And the question is, when you are designing materials that to cover more than one language, do you all have recommendations as far as, I'm from Texas, for the longest amount of time we used to have our voter registration application in English and in Spanish. And it was very busy, sometimes difficult to read. So it was redesigned so that we have a Spanish form and an English form. But of course, the risk there is that you may not have the Spanish form available as, you know, in local offices. Anyway, I'm wondering if you have a recommendation on a best practice as far as how to include all the required languages on all the required forms.
No. I do think that many of these forms are available now electronically as well as in paper format. And we were surprised in doing these site visits at how unaware some of the local registrar's offices were that there were alternative forms of access, even if they didn't have the forms available in paper, that there might be other ways of accessing the forms. It just seemed odd to us.
I mean, I would just add to that, I think a simple but important observation that translation is best done when it's not thought of as just being a one-way translation. So the worst case scenario is one where you just taking a set of text written in English, plug it into Google Translate or Bing and expect, I mean, if you try traveling in Europe with Google Translate, you'll either wind up in jail or some other kind of compromising situation. So in the survey world, which is mostly the work that I do to interview Asians in 9 different languages, you have to start with an English questionnaire, translate that to different Asian languages, back translate that to English to see if it makes sense in English if you only give the translation to non-English speakers, and then go out and test it to see if it really works after you've done the translation, back translation. And then I think that would be a minimum standard in terms of translation.
In terms of designing the form, a ballot or a registration form, there's very little data about combining languages in one form. In other countries, they have separate forms, or in Canada, for example, if you fill out the customs form, when you enter the country, it's French on one side and English on the other side. They've worked that out. That is not necessarily going to work here in our observations and usability tests. We see people using English +1, so if they're native Spanish speakers, for example, they'll refer to both. This is very common to go back and forth, and part of it, I believe, is the translation issue. Some concepts don't translate very well, and if you don't start out in plain English to begin with, getting to something that's understandable in another language is going to be pretty much impossible. There is a little bit of data from a study that the EAC sponsored, that the Design for Democracy project did in 2006 and 2007. That is part of the recommendations in this tome called Effective Designs for the Administration of Federal Elections. And the recommendation there is 2 languages on the ballot. But there's really not a lot of data. This is a thing that I would like to spend a lot more time studying.
Yeah, I would echo that there's not a lot of data. When I served on the TGDC, one of the reasons why there's a requirement for voting systems that they be able to switch languages or switch user preferences at any time was from a study that watched people start out insisting that they were fine in English and get to the ballot questions and suddenly need to switch languages. We've seen in some medical research that side-by-side is very helpful when people are checking words. Does this really mean what I think it means? That to be able to easily switch back and forth between languages can increase proficiency, but putting 2 languages or more on a form makes the design challenge a lot greater. Design for Democracy did some work in Chicago with putting Chinese and Spanish on the same ballot page as the English, but it does take not having too crowded a form, and it takes designing it very carefully so that the weighting of the languages doesn't fight with each other.
Commissioner Patrick?
Had one more short question for the professors in regards to moving forward with Section 203 coverage. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on the change to the 5-year determinations and the basis being within the ACS. And as you're looking across the country, I know it changed dramatically, some of the coverages. There were many jurisdictions that were certain that they were going to get coverage and then did not receive it. Many of them went ahead with their language programs anyway because they saw the need, even though it was not identified, being based on the ACS. And there were other places that lost coverage that they knew they still needed. So I'm curious what your take is on that, and moving forward, if you think having it be a shorter period every 5 years instead of every 10 years, if that will potentially assist that group of voters.
I think the transition to the 5-year redetermination based on the ACS is probably a positive step, in part because the demographic changes that have been taking place over the last 30 years and simply have affected some areas much more rapidly than others, particularly in this last 10, 15 years in the South and Midwest. You've seen very rapid changes in the immigrant populations, faster than can be then a 10-year adjustment would be able to help. I think that's all I want to say.
Yeah, I would just agree that I think 5 is better than 10 because of the rate of change. The one addition I would make is the ACS is a little bit of a double-edged sword in the sense that it's better able to document change as it is happening, but it is based on a sample-based approach rather than actual full counts. And so for a lot of Asian languages, sometimes you may get above the requisite threshold but not know it because sample-based approaches of counting are bad at getting to the extremes. So, for some of the smaller Asian populations, they may actually need coverage in their jurisdiction, but you may not be able to assess that properly by looking at the ACS.
It seems as though we may be having a trade-off between the nimbleness of the 5-year and the accuracy of a broader survey.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Chairman Bauer? Too many words.
We flaunt our nonpartisanship here. Professor Jones-Correa, I just wanted to understand a little bit more about the character and the nature of the research that you conducted into the implementation problems in the counties that you studied. So, in particular, with reference to what you just researched in the vein of host county ideology, I just have a few questions I wanted to make sure I understood. First of all, are you referring to ideology or referring to partisanship? Is it by party or by point of view in some way that you are looking at the signals, and I'll get to the question of signals in a minute, the signals that go out to the populations in these counties, or to the, excuse me, to the local officials in these counties.
More correctly, it's partisanship, not ideology. So the measures we have are measures of party vote and party control of the State House and governorship.
And do you have, since you mentioned State House control, gubernatorial and State House control, and of course the elections are administered on the local level.
Yes.
Do you have comparable sort of analysis of what the partisan makeup is at the local levels where the signals that you referred to might have been received?
So the partisan difference in the presidential election vote is at the county level, but we don't have a measure of county level elected officials.
So the partisan makeup of the county level elected officials on the sort of signals receiving end is not established.
That's right.
So you could have a Republican State House, but you could have Democratic local officials who are administering the elections.
That's correct. Although we do have this measure of county level vote, so the difference between the Democratic and Republican vote at the county level. So presumably, if a county is very Republican, then they're likely to have Republican elected officials. But that might not always be the case.
Okay. And do you have research into what type of signals you're talking about that might affect the implementation at the local level? You referred to signals that might result in this serving two masters syndrome.
Right. No, this is really drawn from the literature in political science on bureaucracies and on principal agent theory. So the difficulties that elected officials have, or in this case, the federal agency, the Department of Justice, would have in maintaining oversight over local agents, in this case, the county election officials. But I have to say that it is, that very end of the paper is somewhat speculative.
On the signals point?
Yes.
And then just last question that I wanted to raise, is it, and you have to appreciate my limitations in the matter of social science research are vast. So I just want to make sure I want to make sure I understand this. Is it, if you are seeing an effect like the one you described, is there any, how do you control for the possibility that if you have essentially limited party targeting of those populations and much lower political engagement by those populations, that has the effect, that the causal factors don't run, in fact, the other way?
Right. So some of those things, so the results that are reported are the results for those variables holding the other variables in the models at their mean. So there are other variables that you're controlling for. So some of the other variables that we're controlling for in those models are Latino voter turnout, Latino registration. So we're controlling for those variables so that we can see what the effect is of this difference between Republican and Democratic partisanship at the county level. So some of these things we can control for, but not everything. So there might be some omitted variable, which might help explain why we see some of this variation, and that's possible. So there are limits to the social science research.
Okay. So, and do you look at, for example, the difference between battleground, are there battleground states versus non-battleground states kind of sort of analysis?
I didn't in this model, but I could. And
again, going to the question of whether that has some impact.
It does. And so
Yes.
Other research that I've done that has control for battleground status, if you're a voter in a battleground state, you are more likely to be contacted, for instance, you're more likely to turn out. And so it might be something to take into account.
But it wasn't in this particular.
It wasn't in this particular.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions? If not, thank you all very much. We will take a short break and then begin the public testimony in about at a quarter of. We're moving up the schedule, which we recognize, so if everyone is not here who is signed up when we begin, we'll come back at the end for that to include. Thank you.
Podium mic check. Test, test.
Check, 1, 2, check, check, check. Check, 1, 2, check, check.